Hi, welcome to our live this afternoon. We're actually recording this earlier and posting it. But today I have the privilege of interviewing a friend and colleague of mine, Miss Michelle Hurn. Hi, Michelle.
Hey, thanks so much for
Michelle
having me on. I appreciate it.
Michelle is a registered dietitian. She is an author and an ultra marathon runner. She's got lots of good experience for us, and we're just going to kind of have a conversation. And maybe we'll have her on later again this year to discuss some specific topics that you guys might have in mind. So, Michelle, start us off with just telling us what got you interested in becoming an RD, a registered RD.
Yeah. I'll try to give you kind of the Reader's Digest version of my life. When I was 12, I was diagnosed with a very serious eating disorder, anorexia nervosa. I was 5 feet tall and about 57 and a half pounds. So I was immediately went into inpatient treatment for 60 days. Put on the 24-hour tube feeding system, and at that time, the number one ingredients in tube feeding formulas were corn syrup, maltodextrin, canola oil, soy protein. It's still that way today. And I was put on the standard American diet, and I was told, even as a 12-year-old, like, if you survive this, which statistically the odds weren't great for as low as my BMI was, and I was having issues, arrhythmia with my heart and kidneys were shutting down. But if you survive this eating disorder, you're going to have to be a high functioning human with an eating disorder. You're always going to deal with depression, always going to deal with anxiety, always going to deal with racing thoughts, will probably relapse. And so I remember, even as a young person, being like, oh my gosh, this is terrifying. Like, if I survive, this will be my lot in life. And they were correct for a very long time. I struggled, was underweight in high school, but food saved my life. I did become weight restored. And so I wanted to know what, was there something I could do to just basically heal yourself or fix yourself, right? And I knew if food had helped me, how many more people could heal by changing how they ate. And of course, I was trained in the traditional dietetics world, which teaches you, very high carbohydrate, lower fat, lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of healthy whole grains, sugar in moderation. Throughout my 11 years working in the clinic, I was told that, there's no such thing as food addiction or sugar addiction. It's people making excuses not to change. And I saw a lot of flaws in the system and things that didn't make sense, like feeding someone with type 2 diabetes, lots of carbohydrates. Once again, like I said, the tube feeding formulas haven't changed and they're highly inflammatory. But it wasn't really until I lost my own health. I had my own health crisis in 2019 that I really dove into the low carb world and realized how many clinical studies, how much information there is on this, and just how powerful it was for a multitude of conditions. So, it's been a wild journey.
Yeah. So how long did you work as an RD before you found out about the low carb approach and the benefits of it?
So I became an RD in 2009. And so, I left the hospital setting in 2020. So about almost 11 years, because I found the low carb nutrition at the end of 2019. And, it just completely changed my world. And like so many, dietitians, I actually I was scared to change. I was like, oh my gosh, is all this fat going to hurt my heart? Doesn't my brain need glucose? All these things were taught, and it's not just like it's skimmed over. It is like pounded into your head. It doesn't matter if you are underweight, overweight, kidney failure, heart disease, diabetes, everybody needs carbohydrates. They are the foundation of human nutrition. And anyone who's following a keto diet or a low carb diet is bananas and they're going to die. Like, that's kind of the message that's like drilled into us as dietitians. So it was really hard, but for me, I really had to, for lack of a better term, hit rock bottom. Like, I was a competitive athlete. I was trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon. And all of a sudden my body stopped recovering. I went from being able to run 10, 15 miles at a time to breaking out in cold sweats on just a mile run, vomiting, anxiety went through the roof. And so, of course, you go to your family doctor, you reach out to other dietitians. Everybody told me I just wasn't eating enough. I needed more carbohydrates. Yeah. Because 400 grams of carbohydrates, the equivalent of, God, what is that? 16 bananas isn't enough. And of course, eating more carbohydrates didn't made things worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, I basically decided I was never going to run again. My whole body hurt. And I knew, I was like, well, if I'm not going to run, and I intuitively knew that all these carbohydrates were not making me feel well, why not try a low carb approach?
Hmm. And so going from high carb to low carb, how quickly did it take to notice a difference in your own body?
Well, first, I definitely want to disclaim that the first about week and a half was really
Mm.
rough.
Oh
It was
yeah.
really rough. I don't want to ever, I think sometimes I glaze over that because the long-term benefits are so good. But that
Hmm.
first week, it's like I wanted to claw my eyes. Like it's just the craving. I've been
What
eating
am I doing to
so much
myself?
sugar. Yes. And of course, my wife thought, oh, this is a terrible idea. This is eating disorder. And I was working in the hospital. And my other dietitians were saying this is a terrible idea. And here I am, like almost, shaking with cravings.
Hmm.
So, and I had headaches. I didn't know how important it was to make sure you get adequate fluids and electrolytes. I know that now. Everybody get electrolytes.
Yeah.
Um, but it was relatively quick for me that
Okay.
I experienced improvements. You get past those, for me, it was about a week of just misery. But
Hmm.
within about a week and a half, my body wasn't hurting. And I was experiencing back pain, muscle pain. And, at first I just attributed it to like, well, I'm not running.
Hmm.
But the calmness, the ability to have just to sit, to not have all these racing thoughts, to not think like, yeah, am I hungry? Should I eat? It's 10 o'clock, but to not let, all the things, somebody who's dealt with an eating disorder, you're constantly thinking about food.
Yeah.
I like to say it. I felt like a lot of the times I was standing on the sidelines of my own life because it was just, you can't enjoy the moment
Hmm.
because it's always in the back of your head. And for the first time, I felt very present. I felt like, I could just be in the moment. I'll never forget, I was in a meeting and my dietitian coworker was kind of shaky. She's like, I got to go get a snack. Do you want a snack? And I was like, Christy, we're going to eat lunch at like noon. She's like, Michelle, it's almost 2. And that would have never happened in my high carb because I was always riding that blood sugar roller coaster.
Yeah.
It was just like, wow, I can go for 4 or 5 hours without eating, and I'm not, here saying like, obviously if you're underweight and you're struggling, you need to go long periods of time without eating, but the blood sugar stability, the mental clarity and calmness that I was experiencing literally blew my mind. And I shared on other podcasts that about 3 weeks into eating this way, I came home. My wife had actually beat me home. She normally works later than I do. And was sitting on the couch and was like, hey, will you talk to me? I need to talk to you, which like, if you're married or you're in a relationship, that's usually not a great thing. Like, hey,
Yeah.
so I
Something
was like,
bad
oh
is
no,
coming.
like, am I in trouble? Did somebody die? Like, and she just was blown away. She was like, I don't know if I like how you're eating yet. Because she
Yeah.
was worried it was quote unquote restrictive, right? She
Hmm.
said, but this is the best your anxiety has been in the 11 years that I've known you.
Wow.
And so we were both like, whoa, And of
Yeah.
course that led to the rabbit hole of like, all right, well, let's figure out why. Let's dig into all this research. Let's see, what are the experts saying about this? And
Yeah.
led to writing the book.
Yeah, and it's a great book. If
Thank
anybody
you.
is interested in Michelle's book, it's called Dietitian Dilemma. I've read it. It's amazing. I've recommended it to a lot of people.
Thank you.
And, feeding off of what you're saying, I'm very excited about the movement that is happening right now in the low carb world about using this as an intervention to help augment treatment for mental health disorders in general.
Yes.
I think it's been overlooked for a long time, and I'm very excited about the work that I'm seeing. And I think your story just feeds right into that. So you were working in the hospital, you changed your life, you changed how you ate, you were noticing the improvements. And I know when I noticed the improvements in my own health, it excited me and I wanted to share it with other people. It was like this bubbly thing that came out. And it's like, I want other people to know how good that they can actually feel because they have no idea. They're just kind of trapped. But you're working in the hospital in a standard setting. What was it like to have this amazing intervention, like in the palm of your hand, and not really be able to share it with the people that you were serving day in and day out?
Yeah. And, when I experienced the incredible, like I was saying, the mental health benefits, it's like you want to give it a minute. You're like, is this really happening? But
Yeah.
after about like, a month, I was like, this is for real. This is legit. And since I worked in a hospital setting, I had access, and my wife did too. She works in
Mhm.
healthcare, to the clinical trials. Most people can Google Scholar, but you may only be able to get the abstract, right? Like I could print out
Mhm.
the entire thing and go through and highlight. And
Mhm.
especially with type 2 diabetes, I was like, there is so much research.
Yeah.
Holy crap, and that's how I met Dr. Eric Westman. He has so much good research. And the things I read, like we can get people off 150 units of insulin in 8 days. Like I had patients that were diabetic for 30 years. I mean, I've seen amputations, rotting teeth, dementia. And so I initially, very naively, was very excited. I set up appointments with my clinical director, the head of the hospital, like, look at what I have. Put me on this. Let me lead this. Let me start a task force. Let me train the dietitians. Let's start implementing this for our outpatient diet, outpatient and inpatient. They're here acutely. They won't have to come back, I was immediately like,
shut down.
Yeah. I mean, you would have thought I was saying, let's, set the place on fire and do a dance. Like it's just immediately like, oh no, absolutely not. And like, well, look at this research. Like, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting. No, we have to follow the guidelines. But it was explained to me that because of insurance will not reimburse because the guidelines are the federally accepted standard of care.
Yeah.
That if somebody were to follow this low carb way of eating and have an issue, whether it was related to that or not, they could sue the hospital.
Yep.
And I said, okay, well, what if, I had all these ideas. Well, what if we have them sign a waiver? What if this is real? This is good information. No, you have to teach a type 2 diabetic that they can eat 45 grams of carbs 18 times a day. I'm hyperbole a little bit, but basically most of our type 2 diabetics had about, between 250, 350 grams of carbs a day. And we would just teach them how to do it and dose them with insulin.
Yeah.
And I did not do well.
Thus your exit from the hospital.
Yes.
You just couldn't live in that environment anymore. Yeah.
Well, and it's hard. I have students reach out to me. I have dietitians reach out to me and say, like, I don't know what to do. And I like to say it like this. I work now with some chiropractors and, an alternative health clinic. What if every time you adjusted somebody, every time they came in, they're in pain, you adjust them, you knew after they walk out, they're going to be worse. Yeah. Could you do it? You're making money. Yeah. Could you ethically do it? And every single one said no. But that's what that's what we're doing. And it's different if you don't know. If the classically trained dietitians, they think they're helping. Like I've never met someone in healthcare, nurse, doctor, dietitian that's like, yeah, I just want to make someone sicker, have them die sooner,
Gotta have them come back again.
Yeah. And even, but we can't be naive. This is how healthcare in our country works. I cannot kill you because if I kill you, I lose you as a customer. I cannot heal you because if I heal you, I lose you as a customer. I have to keep you perpetually sick. I have to teach my dietitians, teach my nurses, teach my doctors to function in a way that you will keep coming back. And it's worked really well because, you come back with prediabetes, next it's diabetes, next it's an amputation, next it's your teeth, next it's a peripheral neuropathy, you can't feel your feet. So, it's a really sad system.
Almost like we have created our own chronic progressive diseases that should not be chronic progressive diseases, but we've created them in our.
Yeah. If you could monetize it, if you could reverse it, if you could monetize people healing, I think you'd see a lot more change. You'd see change very quickly because it really is all about money, and everybody, and most people like kind of know that, like, oh yeah, I know it has to do with profit and I'm not, anti-capitalist or whatever. But, the Academy of Nutrition, which is the governing board of all dietitians, is not only heavily sponsored by companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Frito-Lay, Quaker, but they are now, we had a report last year that they're investing in their stocks. Like, if that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I'm shocked that more dietitians aren't like losing their mind about that.
Yeah. It just feeds into that system that's there. And, it's not just dietitians too. In the primary care world, we are, I see a patient, I'm not graded on whose A1C I got to 0 with a nutritional plan. I'm graded on whether or not I've prescribed them metformin and an ACE inhibitor for their blood pressure and a statin for their cholesterol, even if they don't necessarily need these things, but I don't get paid extra or get paid better if I get rid of somebody's diabetes.
Exactly. So if we as a society decided to monetize, we're going to monetize healing. Once again, I think you'd see a lot of changes real fast, but instead we monetize the opposite, right? We monetize, they're coming back for more surgery. They need more insulin. They need more metformin. And as long as we have that system in place, I do not see a change coming quickly.
Yeah. Don't see an exit ramp there at all. So when someone is in the hospital, they generally think, all right, if I'm in the hospital, I'm being fed healthy food because I'm at a place that's supposed to make me better, right? So say someone is in there and they're diabetic. Describe what the general meal is that they're going to receive for, say, breakfast. Let's just do breakfast. What's the general meal that they're going to get on their plate?
Yeah. And you know what's interesting is like that you said, I used to think as a young person, like a hospital that is the one place where it's like, we're going to reduce your inflammation and oxidation. Everything you receive here is to heal you.
Yep.
It's honestly probably the worst. Well, nursing homes are a little worse, but hospitals are right up there. It will blow your mind because once again, it's the federal terrible guidelines. So a typical diabetic breakfast is going to be pancakes, like an orange or a banana, usually low fat though, you know, margarine, you're going to have sugar-free syrup, 2% milk. And I'm trying to think what else we would normally see on the, you know, there's usually, yogurt, like a sugary yogurt. So a typical diabetic breakfast probably has between 500 and 700 calories and averages between, you know, 75 and 100 grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah. And for our viewers here, how much sugar does that carbohydrate equate to for that diabetic person?
Yeah, you know, the typical amount of sugar per day that I saw in the hospital for diabetics was about, I have to look at my book again, but I think it was 20 to 30 teaspoons a day.
Yeah.
It's worse for mental health. It's like 45 teaspoons.
And is that added sugar, or is that like what the carbohydrate they're eating is going to metabolize into their body?
It's both. Added sugar, we're probably talking about, you know, between 15 to 20 teaspoons. So that's still a lot of sugar. You know, if you don't know, like go to your, you know, take a thing of sugar. Well, I don't know if this is good for you to do, but if you just watch somebody like take a teaspoon and like when you pour that out teaspoon after teaspoon, you're like, this is what I'm putting in my body every single day as someone who cannot metabolize sugar. Like to say that out loud, we're feeding somebody carbohydrates to break down into sugar. I can no longer metabolize sugar. Does this make sense? And this is what I tell people to ask your doctor, ask your dietitian, have them explain it to you. Because I have yet to have, you know, I even ask like, well, tell me why this happened or tell me why you're doing this. I've yet to have someone explain this to me. And I also want to make a point that when I worked in the hospital, I would have nurses and I would have patients tell me like, oh, my blood sugar is excellent. And then you see they're on a lot of insulin. If you're a type 2 diabetic or you have, you know, type 2 diabetes, and you're eating carbohydrates and then taking insulin, that blood sugar does not go into this like alternative universe. It's not like, oh, it's gone. It's great. You know, if you have type 2 diabetes, your cells are saturated with sugar. There's no more room at the end. We've all seen that show Hoarders. Like that's what's happening in your body. This is not good. And so if you take in more sugar and you take insulin, what happens?
Just get shoved in the cells more.
Exactly. It gets shuttled and there's no more room for glucose or glycogen. So it has to be stored as fat. It has to be stored as fat. And there's two types of fat, visceral fat or subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous is like, if we're watching this like on, on a podcast, you might not be able to see, but if you can see me if we're on like YouTube, it's kind of like the fat on your body, like your arms.
Stuff you can touch.
Yes, you can touch. Thank you. Visceral is what's around your organs. And so visceral is very dangerous. We know that people with type 2 diabetes have a 2 to 4-fold risk of having heart disease. And this is why. It does not make sense to continue to have carbohydrates if your body can no longer tolerate them.
I actually describe it to my clients as you are carbohydrate intolerant. Just like someone is lactose intolerant, you are carbohydrate intolerant. It may not kill you in this moment, but it's going to kill you down the road.
It will.
So,
100%. And but the good news is we just, at least in my experience in the hospital, is we don't teach people like, we can fix this. Like, let's work together. You know, I mean, I can tell my 6-year-old niece, like, hey, honey, if you have, you know, too many carbs, what would you have somebody do? She's not going to be like, oh, let's have more carbs and give you medicine. She'd just be like, oh, just don't have carbs. You know, someone who hasn't been like, you know, pounded with like incorrect information from the, you know, pharmaceutical and food industry.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I want to change gears just a little bit. So in some of the talks that I've heard from you, you've advocated for more of a animal-based diet for eating disorders. This is complete opposite of what is prescribed and used and taught for any eating disorder that is out there. But is there a particular eating disorder that this way of eating would be contraindicated for? And what could the benefits in eating disorders in general with a more animal-based diet instead of a carbohydrate plant-based diet?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just to start, I know it's an incredibly controversial topic. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's probably the most, let's just say interesting messages I've gotten, some not so kind. And I get the basis, right? The basis is you can't ask somebody with a dysfunctional relationship with food to restrict or eliminate certain food groups.
Yeah.
And so my response always is like, okay, well, I have a multitude of responses. One, the recovery rate of eating disorders is really bad,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the relapse rate is about 50%, and they define relapse as like actually like met the DSM-5 or actually went back to being institutionalized, not like I'm just having these thoughts or acting on these behaviors. That's probably 100%.
Yeah.
So, I always say, and I've disclaimed in my book, like there's nothing is worth your life. Like if you are truly underweight to a point that, your system is shutting down and you had to have like fluids or tube feeding, perhaps at that point it's contraindicated, right? Like you can't actually take
You
in
gotta live for
food, right? Like if you are that medically compromised, then that's not something I think anybody would argue that, okay, this isn't a good situation or a good idea, at least in that time period.
Yeah.
And I would always defer to, I'm not a doctor, if your doctor says like you are so underweight or you have some type of issue that you're not going to be able to take in all this oral food, right?
Mm-hmm.
Potentially that's an issue. But for the vast majority of people, and we're starting to have really good research with binge eating disorder, and bulimia. There's a great case study with Dr. Sethi Shabani, and they had 3 people with like lifelong binge eating disorder. And they put them on a ketogenic diet, and it's not like 3 people who knew each other, like they didn't, and the results, what they were hoping was they would have improvement of symptoms. Like that's our goal. And all the people were morbidly obese. And not only did they have like statistically, very improvement of symptoms, like they had, for the most part, remission. And it was a animal-based ketogenic diet. And the question, and also they had statistically significant improvements of mood. They were like, wow. And I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Like you're losing weight, you're not engaging in behaviors, you're going to feel better. But the goal being like, when we fuel our brain with ketones versus glucose, when we stabilize our blood sugar, when we stop eating sugar and processed foods, that not only impacts, obviously keeps our hormones very stable, but that impacts our brain chemistry. Your brain can actually function and do what it's supposed to do. There's some very interesting research, and insulin, your brain has insulin receptors. We didn't used to think this. And, one of my hypotheses is potentially people with eating disorders, with major depression, bipolar disorder, we just don't metabolize glucose in the brain very well.
Yeah.
You add that to a food system that has designed all these ultra processed foods that just give your, blood sugar a huge spike. So no wonder we're seeing like all these spikes in anxiety and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and even eating disorders. So if we are fueling with ketones, if we are eating in a way that keeps our blood sugar stable, could that potentially, help people with eating disorders? And then my hypothesis is yes. And I've seen people do it. Of course, you can turn any way of eating into an eating disorder way. I think, obviously you need to have support. You need to know what you're doing. You need to be willing to have adequate calories, certainly if you're underweight. But, I've seen a lot of success with people specifically with binge eating disorder and bulimia. And we have a few really good case studies with anorexia.
Yeah. And, I see that in my clinic as well with binge eating disorder. I treat a lot of that with my weight management side of things. And, I think some of it is removal of trigger foods because, the binges can happen for a multiple of reasons. And sometimes they happen for not reasons at all, but sometimes it's just getting that trigger food and that hit to the brain. And there's a connection between food addictions and binge eating disorder. And honestly, I feel like we need to treat it more stop trying to moderate. Not everybody can moderate things. It's, in fact, speak to that, the idea of processed foods in moderation and what that looks like within bulimia and binge eating disorder. And that might not be the best option for us.
Yeah. I interviewed a woman and she told me, she was 360 pounds. She was suicidal. She had been into, psychiatric treatment 4 times, wouldn't even leave her house. And she said she just couldn't stop binging, and she would go to treatment and get a little better. But the message was, you will know you are well when you can eat all foods in moderation.
Mm.
So to her, and what she was told was that there's something fundamentally wrong with you if you can't figure this out.
Yeah.
So she would, she would eat a diet and she was doing just fine. But she said, they told me now you have to reintroduce these sugar foods. And she said, I bought, just a Twix bar and I cut just a tiny piece off and I ate part of it. And I was like, I'm good. I threw it away. And she said, about a minute later, I dug it out of the trash, ate the whole thing, went to the store, bought more. And then she's the failure, right? That's what the system says. The system says, you are a failure. Now we have to start over.
Yeah.
So what if we changed our system? To me, that's the biggest bullshit I've ever heard. What a horrible, I can't imagine telling an alcoholic, and that's, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but, if I brought alcohol to my job, they're going to ask me, you better put that, what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly if I brought, cocaine to my job, I'm going to get fired,
Mm-hmm.
but if you bring donuts to work, you're a hero. It's the one socially acceptable, potentially addictive food, and to a lot of people, it's food addiction is real. Sugar addiction is real. And as a society, we need to start treating it like that and respecting it like that.
100%.
Because she said, it wasn't until she eliminated these foods that she healed. I mean, today she looks like a totally different person. Mm-hmm. But she told me, normal weight, very healthy human, gorgeous woman. She said, but what has changed the most is my outlook on life. She's like, I literally wanted to take my own life. I have children and I just didn't care anymore. I was so low. But being able to eliminate those foods, and those trigger foods, we know Dr. Georgia Ede has put some really good research out there on what these foods do to our brain. Mm-hmm. Because most people can say okay, I know if I've ever used a continuous glucose monitor, I eat these foods, my blood sugar goes up, blood sugar goes down. Mm-hmm. What happens in our brain? And we now know that over time, when you're eating these processed foods, you have lots of, neurotransmitters, but glutamate and GABA are two really important neurotransmitters. Your brain wants to keep these really level, everything is well when they're level. But processed foods over time actually acts the same as illicit substances or a major brain trauma. Glutamate mm-hmm. is pedal to the metal. It can go up to 100 times the normal amount when you're eating, like I said, the standard American diet. We see this actually in suicide victims, people, their glutamate is just through the roof. And when it goes that high, it actually suppresses neuroplasticity. Your brain can't change, mold, take in new information. And so as you're getting that, blood sugar spike, that dopamine release, everything is great. Your brain is basically shutting down your ability to process things. And then of course you're going to come back down. You're going to think you're a failure. It's a horrible system. It's literally hijacking your brain. And then you have doctors and dietitians and nurses being you should be able to eat that in moderation. Yeah. So we literally have overrode your brain, and then we blame you. It's really sad. And it's really when you look at it like that, you're oh my gosh, no wonder I've been failing, And so just like alcoholism, get it out of the house, be honest about it, be tough about it, don't. And it's hard because, everybody, friends, family, oh, why don't you try this? Why don't you have this? Whatever. It's hard. It's hard to live in the modern world and because it's available everywhere.
It is. And, if you're someone who feels like you struggle with some food addiction or food triggers or feel out of control of food, putting yourself in a situation where you're surrounded by supportive people is vitally important. You can't do it 24/7, but you can go to an Overeaters Anonymous or have a provider or a counselor or someone or even family members to support you. That support is essential to your healing type thing.
Yeah, 1,000%. If you can have a community, you can have somebody, and just being really, I've just found with recovery in general, you just have to be really honest. This is so important for me, right? Mm-hmm. And we had talked a little bit offline, I've never been obese, but I've had obviously a serious eating disorder and anxiety at the point that I was suicidal, as recently as 2017. And so for me, from a weight standpoint, could I probably go and eat a bunch of sugary products? Yeah. And I'm very athletic, but what that does to my mental health is not good. Mm-hmm. And so, I've had to be okay telling people, family, friends, yeah, I'm just, I'm not going to be partaking in that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe one day our country's food environment and idea of how we think of foods will change. I don't see it happening anytime soon, just because, the food guidelines are what they are. Like you said, they are fed into by the food companies, not necessarily the farmers that are creating whole foods. I don't see a lot of people binging on ground beef or peppers or things of that nature.
Yes, it's much
But
more unusual to be overeating whole foods than it is processed foods.
100%, 100%. All right, so let's shift gears again on a more fun topic, kind of. You are a runner. You said that ultra marathon runner. What is an ultra marathon runner? Because I run a mile. And
It's a
that's
crazy human.
about
No, it's a ultra marathon is anything over a marathon distance. So like 50 kilometers is 30 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles, things like that.
Okay. And there is this big idea out there that you have to have carbs for any type of endurance sport. And I would consider ultra marathon running and very much endurance sport.
It definitely
So
is.
tell me, do you need carbs to do that? And what does that look like? Can you do that off of more of a low carb diet?
Yes, and this is, I think, where it gets a little confusing for people because people have reached out to me and be like, "How do I run a marathon on zero carb?" And I'm like, "Oh, that I wouldn't do that." So I use them, specifically and strategically because
Gotcha.
our guidelines, especially for athletes, are going to tell you like before you run carbs, during run carbs, after run carbs, carbs all day, carbs, 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 and that's what I did for a long period of time. But what I have found is that you're any athlete, whether you're a marathon runner or you're a high carbohydrate athlete or a low carbohydrate athlete, your goal is to defend muscle glycogen. You don't want to bonk. You don't want to hit the wall.
Yes.
If you, most people run a marathon or a long distance event, like we've been there, where it just feels like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I'm running in quicksand. It's not a fun feeling because we don't run out of stored body fat. Because even people like the very elite Kenyan runners who are 6% body fat, I mean, we have 100,000 calories of body fat. Most of us have way more than that. But we only have about 2,000 to 2,400 calories of stored carbohydrates. So we run through our muscle and liver glycogen. So the goal is how can I eat in a way to teach my body to burn that fat for fuel because it's much more efficient, even at faster paces. And so by following a low carbohydrate diet, I no longer require so many carbohydrates during my events. I did a 6-hour run or 6-hour race, with less than 20 grams of carbohydrates an hour, where before, you're having a goo every 30 minutes. So, 25 to, I guess that would be about 50 to 60 grams per hour. So, so I use carbohydrates specifically and strategically, the goal being like, I want to keep insulin as low as possible. I don't want to start running with my blood sugar. That's probably the biggest mistake most runners make is they're going to have a high carbohydrate meal or snack like right before they run. And when you do that, you immediately suppress your body's ability to burn fat for fuel. Yeah. So man, if you don't have another, and that's, it's brilliant marketing, all the goos and gels. Cause if you do that, if you have a banana before 30, 40 minutes in, you're going to need more sugar. So how do I teach my body that I don't need that much sugar? Can I burn my own body fat? Which is interesting. I used to work with a lot of marathon runners as a dietitian and they were overweight, which is like, how can you run 50 miles a week and be overweight? But they were literally preventing themselves from burning their own body fat by consuming so many carbohydrates throughout the day.
Yeah. I think back to one of my clients I had very early in my practice. I've been a nurse practitioner for 18 years at this point. Nice. But early in my practice, I had a guy that ran every morning and he did have more visceral fat, but he ended up having a massive heart attack. And looking back, knowing what I know now, I think it was because of how often he was spiking his insulin and the inflammation he was triggering in his body and the fact that his diet was predominantly glucose and carbohydrate to support his running. So,
yeah. I mean, that unfortunately, it makes sense. We're taught like, oh, if you're active and you're eating all these healthy whole grains, you're going to be just fine. But once again, when you're constantly having elevated blood glucose, like that's challenging on your system. That's potentially inflammatory. You're going to have release of cortisol. So that's very possible.
Yeah. But you didn't get to that point overnight. You said you trained your body to start using its body fat for fuel. It does take the body a little bit of time to adjust, but once it adjusts, it's a good thing.
Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of people quit because they'll do like a ketogenic or really low carb diet and they just feel awful because you will. I mean, you're literally like, you've been riding on glucose and all of a sudden, you're taking that fuel source away. And so, you know, a week or two, you really have to be patient. You know, it takes months. I say it takes about 6 months to start becoming fat adapted, you know, and obviously you're going to be more fat adapted at month 3 than you were at the beginning. But people who are like, I'm going to be keto and race next month, I'm like, ooh, that's not going to go well. You know, so I tell people, like, you want to keep your volume, you know, definitely keep the intensity low, you know, and you want to keep, you know, you want to build up your volume slowly. And you just want to put your ego on a shelf. You know, when I was marathon training, we'd be out there and in 7:30-minute pace for easy runs. And, you know, I'm doing these longer runs on a low carb diet. I'm like, oh, 9:15. Like, oh my God, I haven't done, like, it's hard.
Yeah.
But then the benefit is so much better. Like, the fact that I can, you know, run for a long period of time, like I can run 3.5 hours without any fuel. Just because I'm able to utilize my own body fat. When I was a high carb athlete, 90 minutes in, I would have been like dizzy, shaky, right? So the goal becomes like, how can I be so efficient at burning fat that when I'm ready to redline it, when I'm ready to race, that I'm going to, you know, have this really, really well-toned fat burning system. And then I will add carbohydrates strategically just to kind of like top it off. And so I'll be able to run fast.
Yeah. So let's step that back one step. If someone is, say, overweight and just getting into exercise, well, how do I phrase this? When I first see a patient for obesity, I actually encourage them not to exercise the first 6 weeks of the program. I'm like, let your body adjust, you know, get into it, and then start easing into exercise.
Totally
But
fair.
many clients that come back to me and say, I can't add exercise unless I have that apple or that banana before it. What would you recommend for someone who is overweight, trying to lose weight and limit their carbohydrates to help get them transitioned into just starting exercise when their body's so used to burning sugar instead of fat for fuel still?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple options, kind of like you said, it always depends on what your goals and your health and stuff are. You know, number one is just like you said, I'm the same, that I would like, let's get the, you know, because if you do the diet immediately and start trying to exercise, like that's a lot of stress on your body. So you can always just start very slow. You can just say, hey, I'm going to go for a walk. Hey, I'm going to do, you know, if I'm doing weights or something, light repetitions. And, you know, there's some good products out there that you can use. I'm a fan of the, you know, Generation UCAN, which is the slow burn carbohydrates. Like, you know, it's got a whole story behind it, but it's designed to, you know, you don't get an insulin response with that. So I've had people use like, have a scoop of that before you go work out. That, or, you know, I don't know of any other thing I would recommend. You know, I just, you gotta kind of power through it. You don't want to be having that quick sugar before, because once again, that's just kind of defeating the point.
Yeah. And in my experience, those people that keep trying to include it to just get through it, it just prolongs the getting through it, you know?
Yeah, we're going to come back down, right? You know, and I'm a fan, like you can see here, if you're watching, I'm, you know, drinking coffee. Like, I think having a little bit of caffeine can be really useful, you know, with caffeine, with some fat, heavy cream or coconut oil or something like that. So, you know, be patient, take your time, push yourself. The human body is amazing. Like, give it time, give it consistency, and you'll get there.
For sure. All right. So what's next on the horizon for you? What are you into right now, working on, that kind of thing?
Oh gosh, it feels like there's always something. Probably the thing that I'm putting a lot of energy into right now is I'm going to be going to Washington, D.C. in June. I'm meeting with like Dr. Finney and a few other, Dr. Wolek, some providers. We are working on drafting a policy to introduce the nutrition guidelines, just to include a low carb option. So we're not trying to change them, because, you know, we feel like that is, oh, I shouldn't speak for them. I personally feel like that's not going to happen. But if we're able to have a low carbohydrate option, that opens the door to hospitals being able to talk about it, to be included in like nursing homes and schools. So that's a big project that I've been working on.
Awesome. And a very worthwhile project, just to give us the option to have a different standard of care with different avenues, because everybody is different. Each body is different. And while you can handle lots of carbohydrates, sometimes if you're running lots compared to my 20 that's total in a day, and yours that you have when you're going to run, you know, it's different for everybody. So.
Yeah. And just the point being that, I mean, nutrition guidelines, they even say that they're designed for healthy individuals. It's like, and we know, like, statistically only 7% of our population is metabolically healthy. So that in itself seems silly, right? Like, we should definitely have options for for other things. And we're pretty excited. We want this to be an option for everybody, not just adults, even for children. You know, the fastest growing demographic of obese humans is children ages 2 to 5, right?
Yeah.
So just getting people, and the whole goal, generally when you reduce a lot of those carbohydrates, they tend to be processed carbohydrates. So getting people off sugars and, you know, things that are pretty low in nutrition quality is, I think, a really good priority.
Definitely is. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining, Michelle. Maybe we'll have you on some other time to do a specific topic. If anyone has a suggestion on something we've touched on that you would like to hear more, please put it in the comments. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.